Are there any groups or individuals working on helping all of us with the cost of this terrible disease? We're spending thousands of dollars on memory care or assisted care living facilities. Medicare does not recognize, I don't think they recognize that it's a disease. It's a mental disease. Okay, if you have a physical disease, we'll take care of you. But you unfortunate people that have a mental disease, well, you take care of yourselves.
Yeah, so everybody hear that. So it's the question of Medicare and I think government help is a complicated one for a couple of reasons. First, Medicare has been around since 1965, but it was developed as a health system for acute illness. So theoretically, Medicare doesn't pay for anything that's chronic. Now, of course, that's not true. If you're taking blood pressure medicine forever, you can get it on your Part D. But it doesn't. So Medicare has never paid for long-term care, except for the rehab part of it, because that is a chronic condition. So that's sort of how this got developed 40 years ago. Now, I don't know if people remember, but it's almost 20 years ago now, in the first President Bush's administration, there was a long-term care benefit passed by Congress, where older people basically were going to be paying, all of us, once we hit 65, would be paying for long-term care insurance. And there was such an outcry from the AARP to everything else that the next session they got rid of the law. So, I have to say, I think as a society, we failed, and it's greedy older people, I'm one of them now, who undid that long-term health care insurance that would have paid for long-term care for people who needed it. So it's that kind of an issue. If you don't have dementia in your family, you say, that's too bad. And I think that's to me, that's very sad. When I was a medical intern in New Orleans, I actually did a month of my training in the tuberculosis hospital. So in 1973, there was still a TB hospital in New Orleans. Now, most of them had closed all around the country, right? There are no more TB hospitals. Whereas the first 50 years of the last century, they were all over every state had many TB hospitals. Why? Because once treatments were developed, tuberculosis went away, basically, and most people could be treated for it. So today, 60 to 80% of people in assisted living and Alzheimer's and in nursing homes have dementia. So if there were ever a good treatment or a prevention, nursing homes and assisted living wouldn't disappear because they do care for other chronically ill people. But that's where the huge cost comes from, a lot of it. So I don't, you're right to say we need to be thinking about better ways of caring for people, and particularly of helping families who are struggling to, with the cost. But I think these days it's going to be it's hard to be optimistic. So people are trying all kinds of things over the world, and there are all sorts of things that seem exciting. And when you go back 5 years later, you find that, unfortunately, none of those seem to be making a difference. Villages and all kinds of things, they're not sustainable, I'm afraid. It's a challenge, it's an important question.
Has there been anything done or any studies going on now with stem cell research?
How about stem cell research? Actually, very few people are studying it in Alzheimer's disease, but there is somebody at the University of Florida who's been studying it. And here's sort of the scientific thinking. Some diseases start in some brain diseases start in a very particular place, and that's where most of their damage is. So for example, in Parkinson's disease, people don't develop symptoms until cells in a very particular area called the substantia nigra die. And you have to lose about 80% of those cells before you can get Parkinson's disease. So there are people really for a decade have been studying whether putting stem cells in that area that will sort of then regrow might help. And it's, so far, I think it's not clear that it helps in the long run. The thing about Alzheimer's disease is, even though it does seem to start in a particular place, by the time at least people develop symptoms, brain cells are dying everywhere in the brain. And it's hard to know where would you put the stem cells, you know. And you probably would have to engineer them. So in Parkinson's disease, we know that the symptoms are due to an inability to make a chemical called dopamine. So if you can take the stem cell and genetically engineer it so that they make new dopamine, it sort of at least seems logical that that might replace what's been killed off. But in Alzheimer's disease, again, the damage is so widespread and all different kinds of cells are affected. At least most scientists, even those interested in stem cells, have said it's not logical. Now, sometimes logic doesn't make a difference in science, but you know, it's a gamble. You're betting when you do scientific experiments, and I think most smart people have said, I'm not going to dedicate my career to that. It seems very unlikely.
I have the word that we have one more question, but I promise this lady back here, but you go ahead. We're going to have
Two more, okay. Great.
Recently I heard that a celebrity was before Congress talking about supporting research for Alzheimer's and nobody came to hear. And that made me sad. Do we need more money in research, or what do we need, and what can the people do to help you?
Well, you know, on the positive, in fact, in the last year, Congress has allocated a large extra amount of money to do Alzheimer's research. So there is a $100 million initiative. A lot of it focuses sort of on what this first question was over here, on these medications that might remove the amyloid from the brain, about $60 million. These studies are very expensive to do. I think on the good side also, a lot of different pharmaceutical companies have actually joined. So these are going to be joint government pharmaceutical company studies. And I think that makes sense. The companies are going to make money from it. But clearly it's costing all of us a lot. And so for the government to be supporting the basic science, I think does make sense. So of course you can always use more money, but that's true for every disease. And I think we have to be careful not to be too greedy. So in the good side, I think 25 years of advocacy and the fact that it affects so many families. Believe me, many Congress people have it in their family, their spouses or their parents. So I think that's part of the reason that this is helping. It affects a lot of people. That does make a difference. So I think we have to keep that pressure on. But again, the thing about supporting a lot of different research studies is the more studies you support, the more goofy things get supported. And in some ways you might think that's bad. But you know, 90% of the studies are focused on this amyloid protein. And that's been 15 years into it. So either that means we just haven't figured it out yet, or it's wrong. So, you know, it says to me we ought to be funding more far out ideas that make some sense, but it's not where everybody's putting their money. And I think that's the benefit of increased research funding. Okay, last question.
I have a question. I don't mean to be critical, but it seems you're a good source for the answer. You mentioned tuberculosis. I think of the vaccine for polio, and more recently the medicines they've come up with to keep AIDS patients alive. Where is the central hub for all this research on Alzheimer's? It seems to me if they share the information, we may be looking at a cure somewhere. There's many brilliant minds around the country and the world studying this, and there's also many brilliant minds making a lot of money off of it by branching off into selling books and TV appearances and things. But there's a lot of legitimate research that maybe never gets recognized. Where is the central hub for sharing this information? And if there isn't one, why isn't there one? And why wouldn't doctors want one?
Well, I agree with all your points. So in this country, Actually, the National Institute on Aging does have an information center for the public called ADEAR, ADEAR. So if you Google that, or NIA, National Institute on Aging, and then ADEAR, you would get to their website. And I will say, I think they, from a public point of view, they have very good information. I think the Alzheimer's Disease Association website is a pretty good source for that as well. And it's interesting, it's not just in this country. So there's actually in the European Union this year is convening a huge conference, pulling together a lot of researchers and people doing health policy work, also to try to figure out, you know, kind of the approach. Yeah, go ahead, follow up.
I meant to say, why is it the doctors and the researchers aren't sharing the information? So there's a lot of information for the public at large. But what is the research community, the professors, the researchers doing to share their information?
My view, I'm an insider, I guess, is no, I think there is a lot of sharing of that kind of information. And again, you know, if you're a drug company and you're working on something, there's some point where you want to keep it secret. That's the way the patent system works, and I don't think that that's bad. But I think by and large there's pretty good sharing of information. At least I don't think that's the biggest problem. I think to me a bigger problem is we're all human beings, and you know, we unfortunately even scientists tend to think like a herd and get kind of stuck going one way, and we're less likely to pay attention to the kind of far out idea. And also, listen, some things are easier to solve than others. AIDS didn't exist in 1980. It was discovered in 1981, essentially, but it was a virus, and people had been studying viruses for a long time. So, by the way, we don't have a vaccine for AIDS. That's proven to be a very difficult problem. But the way they developed all the drugs for AIDS are very logical by studying the virus and what it does in the body, and then developing a range of drugs. So that was a logical thing. The thing about Alzheimer's disease and frontotemporal dementia and Lewy body dementia and all these diseases is we don't quite understand. All we know is they're all protein diseases, but nobody understands, you know, sort of why do they all start in a different place? Why do they spread in a different way? How does genetics and environment interact? Yeah, go ahead.
Wouldn't that mean that's why it's all more important?
No, yeah, and again, I don't think it's a sharing problem. I think it's just too hard for us.
The vaccine for polio.
You know, we probably won't solve that today, but I know Dr. Rabins has another speaking engagement in Fort Myers, and I just want to share with everyone, we got word yesterday afternoon that Dr. Rabin's 4:10 flight to Naples, Florida was snowed in, and he would not be able to make it. So you can imagine the panic that ensued, because no one can replace you. Obviously, you found your way down here. I don't even want to ask how you got down here. We're just so grateful that you're here. Thank you very much.